Thank you, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We are glad to have you all with us. I'd like to start by welcoming Chris Perry, who's the Executive Director of the First 5 Years Fund, to say a few words.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. As Charlie mentioned, my name is Chris Perry, and I serve as Executive Director of the First 5 Years Fund. We've had the privilege of helping run the Invest in Us campaign in partnership with the Obama administration. This is our 4th webinar that Invest in Us has hosted over the last year, and we're really glad to have you with us. Today you're going to hear from a number of experts on inequalities in early childhood education and the importance of public policy interventions, as well as the business case for strengthening public-private partnerships in early childhood education. Last month, the White House Council of Economic Advisors released its 70th annual economic report of the President, shedding light on the state of today's economy. While the economy shows steady growth, the report found that widening inequality still remains. This year, the report features a chapter on the inequalities in early childhood education and the public policy interventions. Today, we're incredibly lucky to be joined by Dr. Sandra Black, who is a member of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Sandra is also a professor of economics at the University of Texas, Austin. Sandra received her PhD in economics from Harvard University. And later, you'll also hear from Dr. Rob Duggar, a venture capital investor, managing partner at Hanover Provident Capital, and co-founder of Ready Nation, which works to strengthen business through better policies for children and youth. It's now my pleasure to hand it over to Sandy Black with the President's Council of Economic Advisors, who's going to get things started.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be talking about our Chapter 4 of the Economic Report of the President. We start by thinking about, I think everyone agrees that public education is viewed as essential for promoting equality of opportunity and making a productive workforce, but I think less attention has been paid to the importance of investments in children even before school has begun. Recent research, though, has shown that the critical importance of investments made in the years before children enter school and the role for public policy in helping improving equality of opportunity. The research suggests that early investments do matter. Many measures of abilities and skills that contribute to future productivity, and that's something we economists refer to as human capital, where you're investing in your own productivity, were once considered by many to be hereditary. But a growing body of research that encompasses economics, neuroscience, developmental psychology has shown that early indicators of a child's potential are often highly responsive to changes in environment and to the actions of parents and caregivers. In turn, improvements or deficits in early investments can perpetuate themselves, in part by enhancing or reducing the efficiency of later childhood investments. So these investments that appear early on persist and get even bigger in the long run, and so that kind of highlights the importance of acting early. So what do we see in the data? We see that many of the disparities in human capital are firmly established before school even begins. These gaps are mirrored by gaps in a variety of parental characteristics and inputs, as well as by differences in the child's development. And this suggests that despite the high potential returns, many families lack the resources, time, and opportunities to make these early investments in their children. And when they're not getting these early investments, these differences persist into adulthood. Gaps that exist at school entry tend to remain stable or even widen as children progress through school. And at the time of school entry, the characteristics of a child and his or her family explain much of the variation in later educational achievement and even later earnings and employment. We also see that policy can make a difference, and there is a real role for public policy. Researchers have studied a broad set of policies that provide investments in early childhood and found significant benefits for parents. And one of the most interesting improvements, not only in short-run outcomes, immediate health and achievement in school early on, but that these benefits persist into the long run, into later educational attainment or earnings. And so the benefits take over the lifetime. And these investments are so cost-effective that this may be one of our best strategies for reducing inequality in later life outcomes. So in addition to benefiting, so these children are doing better in the long run, as a society we should care about this because we're all benefiting as well. Importantly, the benefits include things like higher tax revenue. So if a child is earning more when they're grown up, they're going to be paying more taxes. There's also evidence that these investments early on, before age of 5, lead to lower rates of criminal activity when the child is older. Inequality reduction in public spending on medical care, restoration, other societal benefits in addition to the private benefits that the child gets on his own. So what I'm going to talk today about is the research on early investment in children, focusing on the first 5 years of life. And this complements the 4th chapter of the 2016 Economic Report of the President, which surveys the research on the benefits of early childhood investment with an emphasis on the role of public policy. So I'm only going to talk about the highlights, but I refer everyone to that chapter so you can read it at your leisure. The way the talk is going to unfold is I'm going to first show you some data documenting the disparities that we observe across the income distribution. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the main theories explaining why investments may have especially high returns at this early age, why it's particularly important to invest when the children are very young. And then I'll conclude with some of the federal policies and programs that invest in early childhood health development and education, and talk about some really interesting new research that shows that these policies help children both in the short and in the long run. And some of this goes out looking to mortality rates when the children get old, so really long run outcomes. To give you an idea of why we think theoretically this should matter and why the benefits of investing really early on, there are just a couple different reasons why we think it's important. First, investments that are made when you're very young can accrue benefits for longer. So you want to do this when you're young because you'll be accruing the benefits over your whole lifetime. The second is that when the children are young, they're more prone, they have more developmental capability, so they have flexibility and capacity for change in cognitive functioning and brain development, and it's greatest when they're young. So these changes can have lasting effects on behavior throughout their life. And I think that's really interesting because a lot of people, I think, assume that these characteristics, these abilities and things like that were innate, but there's a lot of evidence suggesting that cognitive skills and other characteristics can be influenced by environmental factors in early childhood. And the last reason that we think it's important to invest when you're young is because these investments can act as a multiplier. So if you invest when the child is young and you invest again later, the benefits of that later investment are multiplied because you're already starting from a higher base. So there are a number of theoretical reasons why it makes sense to invest when a child is young. That being said, there's evidence that a lot of children aren't getting these investments. So when we look at the data, comparisons of early health and human capital measures across different groups in American society reveal large gaps by household income and race, ethnicity, and family structure. On nearly every measure of school readiness, children born into low-income houses enter school at a substantial disadvantage relative to their higher income peers. For example, Figure 1 shows that income-based gaps in math skills, attention, and social skills are well established by kindergarten, and that these achievement gaps persist and, if anything, tend to widen through the 5th grade. Here and throughout the presentation, the focus is on income-based gaps and disadvantages associated with poverty. Well, to define poverty in terms of income, it's important to note that poverty is just a proxy for many other forms of disadvantage that may also stifle investment in early childhood. As we can see in Figure 2, poverty is not evenly distributed by race, ethnicity, and family structure. So you can see that certain minority groups and families with single-headed households have higher poverty rates. In 2014, 15.5 million children lived in poverty in the United States, an overall child poverty rate of 21%, but youth of color and young children of single mothers were disproportionately impoverished. Children whose households are headed by individuals who are non-white, less educated, and single are especially likely to experience poverty, and as a result, they're more likely to experience deficits in early health and human capital inputs and in later life outcomes. So these disparities that we see when we look at overall inequality in the country start early on. When we look at early health outcomes, we see similar patterns. So figure 3 shows that children growing up in poverty tend to do worse across a spectrum of important health outcomes. Birth weight is something that we use a lot when we're talking about early childhood health because it's been shown in the research that it's highly predictive of later life success. So larger birth weight children tend to do better. So studies show that birth weight is a good predictor of short-run health and mortality, but also long-term health and human capital variables, including school achievement and earnings. Children growing up in poverty are nearly twice as likely to be born at a low or very low birth weight and are 4 times more likely to have poor overall physical health. So you can see the disadvantage starts, the minute that the child is born. Figure 4 shows that poor children are also much more likely to experience food insecurity. This means they lack resources necessary for consistent and dependable access to food. And the evidence shows that this is bad for both short-run and long-run outcomes. Overall, about 19% of households with children experienced food insecurity in 2014. And rates of food insecurity are much higher among certain vulnerable populations, including poor households and households headed by single women and minorities. Interestingly, the evidence shows that food security and access to good nutrition are critical in utero and in the early years of life, setting up a child for physical and mental health throughout their lives. So there's some really interesting research that shows that access to nutrition while you're pregnant has positive effects on the birth outcomes of the mothers. Figure 5 shows that stress matters as well. So parental and child stress can be contributors to inferior mental and physical health outcomes for poor children. Mothers living in poverty are also more likely to be depressed and in poor health, which can lead to high levels of stress. And parents living in poverty are more likely to experience cognitive overload. And this means that the stress and concerns with living in poverty can become overwhelming to the point that it affects cognitive functioning, which then can further perpetuate poverty. When children live in poverty, they also may experience chronic stress and cognitive overload, which can harm them when they're older. Children in poor households are disproportionately likely to be exposed to adverse childhood experiences, including neglect and abuse, which can lead to poor health and human capital outcomes later in life. Fewer resources in the household also mean that children from low-income families are less likely to have access to activities and materials that promote learning and wellness, such as high-quality early education and home environments. So, given all these disadvantages, what does this all mean? All these factors, the fewer resources for activities, higher health risks, food insecurity, increased stress, contribute to the disparities between these children and their higher income peers in school readiness. And in turn, this disadvantage that they face upon school entry has long-lasting consequences for their academic achievement, as well as their behavior through their schooling years. The next figures show that socioeconomic disparities and outcomes are evident in children as young as 9 months of age, and these gaps tend to widen as children go older. At just 9 months, infants and toddlers from low-income families score lower on cognitive tests, are less likely to be in excellent or good health, and are less likely to receive positive behavior ratings than their counterparts from higher income families. And by 24 months, the cognitive and behavioral gaps have at least doubled. As figure 6 shows, by the time children enter school around age 5, children in poor households are nearly 4 times more likely to score very low on assessments of math skills, and over 4 times more likely to score very low on reading skills than children in more well-off households. And this puts poor children at a huge academic disadvantage that can be hard to overcome. And then once these gaps exist, they seem to follow children throughout their school careers. And so this suggests the importance of doing something early on. Figure 7 shows that most of the income achievement gap emerges before age 5, and it remains relatively constant through the beginning of high school, suggesting that achievement gaps in later years are established in the earlier years of childhood. As figure 8 shows, non-cognitive or soft skills also differ by family income. And these soft or socio-emotional and behavioral skills are also predictors of later educational attainment and long-term employment and wages. Children experiencing poverty are more likely to exhibit behavioral problems and to perform worse on non-cognitive skills tests. And these findings are likely attributable to a host of stressors that these children face, including things like less safe neighborhoods, increased exposure to trauma, insufficient resources to address their physical and mental health needs, and having parents with unmet physical or mental health needs. In addition to having these outcomes, the inputs these children receive are also lacking. So figures 9 and 10 show there are large gaps in cognitive and non-cognitive skills, may be due in part to large differences in inputs, including both parental inputs and formal high-quality early learning opportunities. Today, inequalities in parental inputs such as time, resources, earnings, and education are higher in the past because as income inequality has grown, so has inequality in child-related expenditures. And to give you a statistic about this that I think is really striking, parents in the top fifth of earners now spend 7 times more on enrichment activities and materials for their children, including things like books, computers, summer camps, music lessons, than families in the bottom fifth. So, I mean, the disparities in investment, both time and resources, is just striking. In addition, figure 9 shows higher income parents generally have more time to spend with their children, and the amount of time they spend has been increasing at a faster rate than among lower income parents. And we think this might reflect, in part at least, that higher income workers are much more likely to have access to things like paid time off and workplace flexibility, which they can use to spend time with their young children. This additional time, particularly time spent playing and engaging in the child's development, is important for early cognitive and socio-emotional development. For example, research demonstrates that reading to children is crucial for early language acquisition and communication skills. The gap is also reflected in the total time spent with children and in activities that engage children. In particular, figure 10 shows that high-income parents spend more time on educational activities with their children, creating an income-based advantage in educational outcomes in the first years of life. For example, highly educated parents spend more time on developing their children's reading and problem-solving skills in preschool and on extracurricular activities for older children. Highly educated parents also spend more time on child care activities such as playing with young children and helping with children's activities. As figure 11 shows, highly educated parents also invest more in preschool education. About 60% of 3- and 4-year-olds whose mother have a college degree are enrolled in preschool, compared to about 40% of children whose mothers did not complete high school. There are also big differences in the environment in which poor children grow up. Around 4 million poor children grow up in high-poverty neighborhoods, and as a result, the neighborhood quality as well as the schools are considerably worse for poor children because of where they live. And there's a large body of literature that highlights the importance of neighborhood characteristics such as accessibility and quality of learning, social and recreational activities, support networks, and the presence of physical risks such as violence, victimization, and harmful substances do affect later life outcomes. Importantly, the research also shows that the duration of exposure to a better environment also matters. So when you can move the child out of that environment at an earlier age, the benefits are going to be even greater. Given these disparities that I've just talked about, what can we do about it? As noted earlier, early childhood investments can result in significant benefits for children, parents, and society, but children from disadvantaged households aren't getting the investments they need to be healthy and succeed. And that's because these investments are often expensive and must happen early while the benefits are realized over a long time horizon. So children can't take out a loan to invest when they're 1 and say, I'll pay it back when I'm old and I'm reaping all the rewards from it. And so because of that, parents often face challenges investing in their children because the costs they have to bear now and the benefits are in the future. And so that's why for parents with limited resources, this is a huge challenge. Second, the investments require significant upfront costs, so this can be difficult for families to afford on their own. And they don't have time, financial resources, or access to affordable credit to make these early investments. Also, because the benefits accrue to society as well as to the individuals don't have the incentive to invest at the right level. So this is the idea of an externality where because investment in me leads to benefits for everyone else, I should invest more in me so that everyone else can benefit from it, but because I don't see the benefits to everyone else, I'm not going to make the right level of investment. So as a society, it's incumbent on us to make those investments, to help increase those investments. Because of these issues, well-designed public investments can play a crucial role in closing income and opportunity-related gaps that affect children's success. And public policy can be the key to ensuring that these investments made now are large enough to pay off in the future and realize the gains shown by research, including the numerous public benefits. So now I'm going to turn to some of the policy interventions that have been shown to be effective at improving the outcomes of children. Several types of public investments target child development, starting before children are even born and continuing throughout early childhood. One of the things that's important to note is that it's actually pretty hard to identify the causal effect of a policy or an investment on children's long-run outcome because it's not random who's getting these policies. So children from poorer backgrounds might be more likely to use different policies or get different investments, and they may end up doing worse, and that's not because the investment didn't matter or the policy didn't work, but because they started from a lower point. And so it's important to try to identify the causal effects by finding situations where it's as if random. So two children are disadvantaged, one gets the investment and the other doesn't, and we compare those outcomes. For a lot of reasons, we don't randomize people into programs often, and so we try to find circumstances in the world that mirror this. So one state implements a policy where another state does not, and so we compare the children in one state versus another where one had the policy and one didn't, and see how did they fare, and attribute some of these differences to the investment or the policy. And so that's one of the reasons that now is we're getting so much new information about the efficacy of these programs, because there are a lot of these types of what we call natural experiments out there that help us identify this causal effect of investment on children's outcomes. So one of the policies that's been shown to be really effective are the Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program, which provide low-cost health coverage to millions of Americans, including nearly 44 million children, and covering 1/2 of all low-income children. There is evidence that prenatal and childhood Medicaid receipt can have large long-term effects on health and economic outcomes, and this is brand new research on the topic. Health gains for children whose mothers received Medicaid while pregnant were accompanied by improvements in high school graduation rates, higher income, and lower food stamp or SNAP receipt. A pair of recent studies have used the fact that states expanded access to health insurance for children through Medicaid and CHIP at different times and to different extents in recent decades to study these long-run effects. One such study finds that female children with more years of Medicaid or CHIP eligibility in childhood had higher educational attainment and higher earnings in early adulthood. As shown in Figure 12, this research shows that access to insurance coverage during childhood can have important benefits for education and labor market outcomes much later in life. These benefits that appear to be driven, at least in part, through sustained improvements in health. And this is showing that there's an increase in taxes paid, and the reason there's that increase in taxes paid is because the person's income increased. In addition, the evidence shows that the more years a child is eligible, the larger the cumulative impact will be. So it's important that they have access for longer time periods. There's also evidence that child nutrition programs help children, both in the short and the long run. Research shows that nutrition programs like the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, commonly known as WIC, and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, commonly known as SNAP, which is also food stamps, have important and long-lasting impacts on health and human capital. There have been a number of studies on the benefits of the comprehensive set of WIC nutrition and health services. These services include healthcare referrals, nutrition education, and the provision of nutritious foods to supplement the diets of both mothers and their children. As Figure 13 shows, recent research shows that WIC participants improved birth outcomes, including reduced incidence of low birth weight, longer gestation, and increased size at birth, all of which are indicators of long-run benefits. Another study shows that access to WIC increased in the third trimester of pregnancy, leads to an increase in birth weight of children of around 10%. And these effects were largest among mothers with low levels of education. Other recent research highlights the benefits of SNAP participation, and the CEA has a report on the benefits of SNAP. So if you're interested in more detail on that, I encourage you to look at that. SNAP is the cornerstone of the U.S. policy to address food insecurity. It's the largest and most universal of a set of federal food and nutrition programs designed to alleviate hunger by supplementing the food budgets of low-income households. And SNAP reduces food insecurity as well as poverty. So new research shows that SNAP improves the health and well-being of people who receive food assistance when they're young children. A study found that mothers' access to food stamps during pregnancy led to increased birth weight, with the greatest gains at the lower end of the birth weight distribution. So even access while the mother is pregnant has benefits on the children. And as Figure 14 shows, increased exposure to food stamps in utero and in early childhood led to a significant reduction in the incidence of metabolic syndrome, which is an index that includes high blood pressure, heart disease, heart attack, obesity, and diabetes, including a 16 percentage point drop in the likelihood of being obese as adults for the children of less educated parents. The authors also find that early access to food stamps led to an 18 percentage point increase in the likelihood of completing high school among disadvantaged adults and an increase in economic self-sufficiency among women. So these benefits, food stamps, when the child is young, and these are, again, we're talking very early in their life, have these huge long-run benefits, suggesting that it's a really important investment in children. Another investment is preschool education. So we probably know the most about this, as there have been many studies on the topic, and we actually started studying it a long time ago, because in the 1960s there were programs that were rolled out that were where children were randomized into them. So they are to compare the ones who go to programs that can actually follow the outcomes of the children in adulthood. The long-term follow-up of these programs sustained improvements in academic achievement, high school graduation rates, and higher earnings. There's also research on currently the most widely available public program for the 1900s was established in collective education. including formal schooling, health and developmental screenings, meals, and family support services for approximately 1 million low-income children annually. The most recent research on Head Start follows nearly 5 who were 3 and 4 years old in 2002. 1/2 of these children were randomly assigned to a group that was allowed to enroll in the Head Start program, and the rest were assigned to a control group who didn't receive access to Head Start but could enroll in another early childhood program. The study found positive impacts on children's language and literacy development during the first year of the program, especially for students whose scores were initially at the bottom of the distribution. There have also been some large-scale programs, including state preschool programs in Georgia and Oklahoma and local initiatives in Chicago and Boston. When they look at achievement, they found positive effects of these public preschool programs on children's achievement. And while it's hard to quantify the findings, because again, you're just looking at kind of student test scores, researchers have done some back-of-the-envelope calculations to estimate that adult earnings for these children will likely increase by about 1.3 to 3.5%. There's also evidence that these preschool programs can affect criminal activity. When the evidence suggests that Oklahoma's universal preschool program lowered the likelihood that African American participants were charged with a misdemeanor or felony when they were teenagers. Although studies find that early child education yields a large return, the payoff may take time to materialize as benefits are realized through behavior or earnings changes over an individual's life cycle, as shown in Figure 15. And so the point of this figure is to give you a sense of why one might underinvest initially, because the costs are incurred at the beginning while the benefits take time to pay off. So when a child attends an early education program, the upfront cost includes not just the dollars that you pay, but any time or effort costs as well. And some of the benefits are realized immediately. So parents who choose to re-enter the labor force or increase their work hours are able to increase their earnings right away. However, as you can see, the majority of benefits from reduced crime to higher earnings for participants accrue later in life. Estimates based on the substantial earnings gains alone indicate that investing in public early childhood education would boost GDP in the long run. Housing vouchers is another way that we can support children and invest in them. Evidence shows that moving to a lower poverty neighborhood as a child can improve the health and educational outcomes of children both in the short and the long term. So there's some really interesting new evidence on the benefits of living in a better neighborhood that came from an experiment that was conducted in the mid-1990s known as the Moving to Opportunity Program, or MTO. MTO allowed researchers to evaluate the impact of both conventional Section 8 housing vouchers, which don't place any geographic restrictions on where the recipients can live, and the experimental vouchers that required families to move to lower poverty neighborhoods for at least 1 year. And so you can see how the families that were required to move to the lower poverty neighborhoods, how those families and those children fared relative to the others. And the new research shows that children whose parents received those experimental vouchers and were more likely to go to college, attend higher quality schools, and even had higher earnings, as shown in Figure 16. Moreover, the earnings gains were the largest when the children's parents moved in their earlier years and fell with the age of children when they moved, suggesting that the cumulative impact of exposure to a better environment is highest when children move when they are very young. The final thing that I'll talk about are income transfers. So that's kind of, we've been talking about things like food and education, but public policy can also provide money. Programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, the Child Tax Credit, and temporary assistance for needy families are targeted mainly at families with children and can benefit children by helping their families to invest more in resources in their early development. So the evidence shows that the EITC improves birth outcomes of women who receive it when they're pregnant. One study compared birth outcomes for single mothers eligible for different EITC amounts and found that an additional $1,000 in EIT receipt lowers the prevalence of low birth rate by 2 to 3%. And in addition, researchers have found that when children's parents receive EITC, the children will end up getting more schooling when they're older. Importantly, these effects are largest for children who received the EITC when they were young, again suggesting the importance of making sure that children are getting this investment early. Altogether, the studies show that EIT received as a young child can have profound impacts on educational and labor market outcomes later in life. There's also new research that shows that cash assistance when you're young can affect mortality when the child is old. So this is I think, really interesting, compelling new work. As shown in Figure 17, in a study of the mother's pension, a cash assistance program in effect from 1911 to 1935, children whose mothers received the pension were more likely to live to age 87. And in addition, the lowest income children experienced the largest benefit. So we're looking at old data and old program, but you have to do that to look at outcomes like mortality at age 87. And the records from the census and enlistment records suggest that these improvements may at least be in part due to improvements in nutritional status measured by whether or not you're underweight as an adult, educational attainment, and income in early to mid-adulthood. So to conclude, when we invest in young children, it's not just children and their families who benefit, we as a society all benefit. The research highlighted here suggests that the investments we make in children today could benefit our economy in the long run, and they do so by expanding our skilled workforce and increasing their earnings, as well as by improving their health and wellness. This means society reaps the benefits of a better educated, higher earning, and healthier population in the future, including lower transfer payments, reduced involvement with the criminal justice system, lower health care costs, and a larger tax revenue base. So expanding access to high-quality programs at the earliest years is a win-win opportunity for participating children, their parents, and society as a whole. It's time to build on demonstrated successes of programs that invest in young children and broaden their scope to boost opportunities for American children. And in the administration, we've made a number of these investments based on the evidence, including expanding Medicaid through the Affordable Care Act, promoting preschool for all, expanding home visitation, proposing to expand the summer EBT, and provide extra food to families with children over the summer, as well as expanding the EITC. So I think the evidence is strong that investing in children when they are young has rewards to the child in the long run, but also to society as a whole.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sandy. That was exceptionally informative and helpful. I want to remind everyone that we'll be making these slides and a video of today's webinar available online later on, probably tomorrow or early next week, so you'll be able to check back with us there. And I also want to note that if you do have questions and we're not able to get to them a little bit later on, please feel free to email those to us at info@investinus.org, and we will do our best to make time to take questions a little bit later. But right now, I want to hand things over to Rob Duggar, who is a co-founder of Ready Nation. He's also, as Chris mentioned previously, a venture capital investor and managing partner at Hanover Provident Capital. And Rob, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really, this is a very exciting webinar. I think that this fourth chapter of the President's Report is kind of a milestone, which people may not realize. If you go back over the last 20 years, say to the 1996, and look at the President's report, economic report, what you'll find is that steadily over the years, more and more has been said about early childhood. This year, we are the entire fourth chapter, so this is really a real milestone, and I think Dr. Black deserves attention, credit for this. I think she's just done a marvelous job. This fourth chapter is one of the best overviews of early childhood investment I've ever read. As a co-founder of Ready Nation, which is an organization of business people advocating for investing in early learning, early health, early childhood generally. There are about 1,700 of us as part of Ready Nation. We've been active in state campaigns, federal campaigns, and particularly over the last 3 years, active in those campaigns, raising over $3 billion in new state and federal funds for early childhood. The important thing, I think, over this last year or so is that 22 states with Republican governors and 10 states with Democratic governors have increased funding for preschool. So even though we're having a conversation today with a member of a Democratic administration, what's extremely important is that the business community, which is primarily on the conservative or the Republican side, understands the importance of what we're talking about. So we see 22 states increasing funding for preschool compared to 10 with Democratic governors. In regard to what is talked about in terms of early child interventions, I think that emphasis on math is still insufficient. We hear a lot about literacy, third grade reading campaign, talk, play, sing, and others, but not the attention to math that it deserves. We have evidence that math makes its own contribution to brain development that's different from literacy, and that early math exposure contributes as much to later reading capacity and reasoning capacity as early literacy does. This is to say nothing about social skills, which to my mind actually may yet prove to be more important than numeracy and literacy, but at this point still insufficient emphasis on numeracy as a cognitive capacity. I want to mention one last thing before we turn to questions. In all of these discussions, we talk about interventions and their impact on the economy, but we don't talk about the sector that produces young adults. We talk about investing in kids as a way of improving the productivity of various sectors, for example, the financial sector, the auto sector, the agricultural sector. Even the research on 18 to 24-year-old capacities is all about the defense sector. 60% of young adults, 18 to 24-year-olds, can evidently qualify to be United States Army privates. But we don't focus on the production of young adults ready for life as an economic output. We talk about financial services as an output, automobiles as an output, agricultural as an output, manufacturing goods as an output, but we don't focus on the fact that of all the outputs our economy produces, none is more important than ready for life young adults. Ready Nation just published today, put on its website, an analysis of the youth human capital sector, looking at the entire constellations of companies and people who are involved in raising kids from birth to age 18. Logically, we could go from conception to age 24 or 22 through college, but this focuses on birth to age 18 and finds that the GDP involved in raising kids from birth to age 18 is over 11%, and that there are hundreds of millions of people involved in this activity, everybody from the people who produce baby formula to high school sports equipment, everybody from obstetricians to high school principals. So when you look at the entirety of what's involved in raising kids, this is one of the largest sectors in the U.S. economy, and investing in it as a sector, just as you think about investing in the manufacturing sector or the agricultural sector, as a sectoral contribution to economic growth and sustainability, we need to think about the youth human capital sector as indeed its own and frankly quite large sector as a way of contributing to future economic growth and sustainability of our economy. So I'll stop there. Encourage everybody to take a look at that report we just released today. It's on our website, readynation.org, and get a sense of, a new sense, really, of something economists, I think economists, would agree that in general we've given a lot of attention to different economic sectors, but we haven't given attention to the sector that produces young adults in the way that that we should. So I'll stop there and let's turn it back to questions, Chris.
Thank you very much. It's incredibly helpful, and we will certainly include links to the report you discussed in our photos out to our attendees, including as well as a video of this webinar. So we do have time for a couple questions, and I'm noticing that folks are submitting them through the question feature here within our webinar system. The first one looks to be a question about the reasons behind CEA publishing a chapter in this year's report, why early childhood and specifically preschool in this year's report. What was the impetus behind including that in this year's report?
Yeah, so it was interesting because as Rob pointed out, I think we've known some of these things for a while. What is new, I think, is all the recent evidence on the long-run benefits of these programs. So I think while we knew that they were effective in the short run, it's taken kind of time and researchers' creativity to identify the long-run effects. So some of the work that I talked about is really recent. So the work on Medicaid, the food programs, the EITC and the mother's pension, and looking at mortality. A lot of that research has been published only, or some of it is still unpublished, or has come out in the last few years. And so I think it's worth taking another look at what we know and saying, okay, we knew that they were effective in the short run, but now we're seeing evidence that there are even larger benefits than I think people kind of anticipated, and it forces you to kind of reevaluate and say, look, these are really cost-effective policies.
Great. Thank you very much. And it looks like we are running short on time. We have one other question which was directed to Rob, and that was about the increased business support for investing in early childhood. I think you should be able to speak to what Ready Nation has been involved with over the last few years, but why do you think that businesses are now seeing this issue as important and speaking out the importance of early childhood?
Businesses see a tremendous pipeline problem. That is, they have large numbers of baby boomers who are within a few years of retirement, and when they look at literally the output of the youth human capital sector, high school and college output of ready for work, young adults, they just aren't there. So they you saw a few years ago enormous focus on high school, and then as they studied the high school problems, they realized, oh gee, we need to look at the elementary school problems. And then as they studied the elementary school problems, they said, oh good Lord, we really have to start much earlier. So there's been a learning process over the last 15 years that has taken, certainly the last 10 years, that has taken most people who are concerned about labor market competitiveness and supply, had steadily moved to the earlier and earlier years. What Sandy Black talked about is enormously important. The appearance of the chapter reflects the increased awareness economically and from a policy standpoint of the need and long-term need for competitive young adults to be entering our labor force in order for the United States to remain competitive. One other factor is it's not mentioned in the report, and I think it will be when further work is done, is that the Pay for Success work has indicated very clearly that pre-kindergarten done right can be paid for through reductions in special education costs in the public schools. This kind of pay for success kind of research has had a very powerful impact. Ready Nation took the lead. We wrote the first papers on how to think about pay for success finance and applying it to scale up early childhood interventions using savings and reductions in government program costs to pay for these intervention expansions. We took the lead in that for two reasons. One, to show that these interventions are effective, but also simply to show business people that these interventions are so effective they can be substantially paid for, or in a few cases entirely paid for, by reductions in program costs. The Salt Lake City preschool program begun in 2013, expanded in 2014, is being paid for through reductions in special education costs. This has had a galvanizing impact. There are 21 states now that are looking at expanding pre-kindergarten further using reductions in special education costs as a way for paying for the expansion. Similarly, Ready Nation took the lead in research on the impact of prenatal counseling. We're showing that the cost of prenatal counseling, it may be possible to pay entirely for the cost of expanding prenatal counseling for at-risk mothers-to-be entirely from reductions in Medicaid costs. These are very powerful dollars and cents effect. They're being increasingly understood by the business community, and that's why the business community is excited, and business support for investing in kids in the earliest points in their lives is steadily growing.
Incredibly helpful, thank you. I think that's all the time we have for today. As I mentioned, we will be making the slides and video of today's webinar available online, so be on the lookout for an email. Everyone who registered and participated today will also be sharing on the InvestNet's website and on social. If you did have questions that we weren't able to answer, I know there were quite a few that came in, please feel free to send those our way, and we will do our best to get answers to your questions as quickly as possible. I want to thank Dr. Duggar and Dr. Black for joining us today for this really incredible conversation about an important perspective in early childhood. We look forward to having all of you join us again very soon for another webinar. So thank you very much, and have a great Thursday. Bye-bye.